Hello everyone, and welcome to another Cut Rate Commander Precon Upgrade Guide, the series where we take a look at Precon decks and bring them up to cut rate standards. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at the Paradox Power Precon from the Universes Beyond Doctor Who set, and its face commanders, the 13th Doctor and Yasmin Khan, which we'll be bringing up from its roughly $50 price point to an increased budget of $85 after upgrades. But before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content, and if you really like it, please consider supporting the channel directly either through Buy Me a Coffee or through our Game Nerds affiliate link in the description. Also, if you haven't done so already, be sure to check out the ongoing 15k subscriber giveaway either on the card on this video or in the link in the description to enter for a chance to win a Bernard Ginger Sculptor Commander deck and to unlock sweet upgrades for it. So, with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commanders and playstyle. Beginning by looking at the Doctor first, the 13th Doctor is a 2/2 Time Lord Doctor that costs 1 and Simic that has the following 2 abilities. Firstly, whenever we cast a spell from anywhere other than our hand, we put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. And secondly, at the beginning of our end step, we untap each creature we control with a counter on it. Then her companion, Yasmin Khan, is a 3/3 human detective that costs 3 and a red that we can tap to exile the top card of our deck, which we can then play until our next end step. Breaking down their core stats, the Doctor is sporting a more lightweight CMC with a slightly below average stat block for her cost, while Yasmin's CMC is more mid-weight while again possessing a stat block that's slightly below average, and their abilities, when combined, enable us to generate card advantage through impulse draw, and then turn the spells we draw with that impulse draw into permanent stat boosts via +1/+1 counters. Taking a deeper look at our Doctor's abilities first, her first ability serves as a simple but effective way for us to take advantage of non-traditional casting to pump our board, the most common of which is of course Impulse Draw, which our colors have no shortage of access to, but other mechanics like Suspend, Rebound, Adventure, Foretell, Flashback, Jumpstart, and others can easily take advantage of this ability as well to reliably distribute +1/+1 counters to our board. And of course, since we also have Simic as part of our color identity, we have no shortage of ways to take advantage of said counter distribution for even more value. This then pairs very nicely with her second ability, which nets us a free untap every turn for the creatures we load up with those counters, making it at worst a pseudo-vigilance to keep our creatures up to block for us after they swing in, or, at best, a way for us to take advantage of tap effects multiple times per rotation to get even more mileage out of them. Effects like Yasmin's, who on her own is a free impulse draw per rotation, which is serviceable, but when combined with the Doctor lets us draw 2 cards per rotation instead, since we can hold on to the card we exile with her until our next end step if we use it on our opponent's turns, making her a fantastic source of on-theme card advantage that we have access to from the command zone to let us cast more spells and reliably make our land drops, all while proccing the Doctor as she does so. Now, based on our commander's abilities, it should be evident that their main game plan is to use Yasmin to impulse draw cards, which we'll then use to proc the Doctor's counter distribution as we cast them, and the base build seems to agree, as it includes a decent selection of payoffs for us casting from exile to work alongside the Doctor, alongside a decent number of spells that cast themselves or let us cast other spells from exile to proc our commander and other payoffs more frequently, and creatures that can take advantage of our +1/+1 counter distribution to generate us value and or make themselves more powerful. But as the old saying goes, more is better, so we'll be adding in even more ways to cast our spells from exile to proc our commander and payoffs at a faster rate, more payoffs for casting spells from exile to generate us even more board presence and value, and more ways to distribute and to take advantage of our +1/+1 counters to empower and derive value from our board even more. Then from there, we'll be giving our ramp package an overhaul so it can take advantage of the now much more affordable land-based ramp Green has at its disposal, and we'll be left with a build whose ability to generate value and build up our board will not leave us disappointed, which is more than I can say about the 13th Doctor's writing, but I digress. So, let's jump into the Hooniverse one final time and join Team TARDIS on one last adventure, facing off against the latest incarnation of the Doctor's greatest nemesis, the Master, with the Doctor's very existence hanging in the balance. And while the Master has allied himself with the Daleks and the Cybermen to ensure that their greatest adversary would never exist, the Doctor has allies of her own, assembling her own companions and those from her past incarnations to face him, all leading to a final conflict that threatens to rewrite time itself should the Master succeed. Still, that's all in a day's work for the Doctor, and, like every other time she has saved the universe, she'll do so with sonic screwdriver in hand and her companions by her side. So, now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's briefly go over the cards that made the cut from the core build. To start off the cards that made the cut from the core build, we'll begin with some of the cast from exile payoffs included out of the box to help supplement the Doctor as we cast the impulse-drawn spells with Yasmin or cast from exile through other means to generate us even more value. For example, on the creature side of things, we'll be hanging on to Memory Worm as a simple source of repeatable burn and hand disruption that keeps growing bigger and bigger over time with counters as we cast our spells from exile, Sisterhood of Karn as an exponentially growing source of +1/+1 counters that can easily grow into a double or even triple-digit threat as we cast more and more of our exiled spells, and Flaming Tyrannosaurus as yet another ever-growing threat that also tacks on targeted removal to every spell we cast from outside of our hand, that also, if our opponents decide to remove it, gives all our opponents a final parting gift of AoE burn that scales with how big it was able to get as a bonus. Then as some legendary exile casting payoffs, Iraxa Empress of Mars will be keeping her spot as a repeatable source of tokens on a decent-sized trampling body that only gets better as we get counters on her. Osgood Operation Double stays in as a repeatable source of card advantage via the clue tokens that she creates that also, if we're able to get a counter on her and her non-legendary copy, generates enough mana to crack 2 clues per rotation. And lastly, the 12th Doctor will be staying in as well thanks to giving us the option to get 2 copies of every single spell we cast from exile, so long as we're willing to give one of our opponents a copy as well, making him both a powerful payoff and a persuasive bargaining chip to make deals with. And lastly, as some non-creature exile casting payoffs, we'll be hanging on to both Surge of Brilliance and Impending Flux, each of which lets us foretell them to proc themselves along with our other payoffs, with the former generating us card advantage based on the number of spells we cast from exile to reload our hands with, while the latter instead uses those spells to turn into a scalable, one-sided board wipe with burn attached to help us retake control of the board, making them both excellent on-theme ways for us to help pad our core stats. Then, with all our retained cast from exile payoffs covered, let's move on to our carried over cards that either get spells into exile for us to cast, or, alternatively, let us cast them from exile to proc those payoffs. In the former camp, we have Ryan Sinclair keeping his spot as an on-attack source of impulse draw, who can cheat the spells he hits off the top of our deck into play based off of his power, whose effect only becomes more and more reliable as our Doctor loads him up with counters to buff up his stats, and the Saga the Flux staying in as a 4-time source of impulse draw that starts off as targeted removal to pick off up to mid-sized creatures with, and culminates as a gigantic source of ramp to help us cast our spells from exile with. Then, as some retained sources of Cascade that we'll be using to get our spells into exile to cast, we'll of course be hanging on to the TARDIS as an easy-to-proc on-attack way for us to grant any of our spells Cascade as we cast them, Bigger on the inside as another way to tack on Cascade to any of our spells while either turning any of our artifacts into a mana rock, or amplifying one of our land's mana production to power up our mana base, And, lastly, Throes of Chaos and Into the Time Vortex as spells whose entire purpose is to cascade into other spells, the latter allowing us to do so twice across 2 turns at no additional cost thanks to Rebound, while the former allows us to cast it continually from our bin to proc our commander and non-traditional casting payoffs twice, so long as we have the lands to pitch thanks to Retrace. Then, pivoting to spells that can exile themselves to enable our game plan instead of having to rely on other effects to do so for them, we'll be keeping the Foretold Soldier as both a card that we can foretell initially to cast from exile later, who can then keep sending itself back to exile to be foretold over and over again as it swings in, more often than not running over a creature in the process via it compelling a singular blocker and its massive stat block. Quantum Misalignment has a way for us to create a non-legendary copy of either of our commanders or any of our other creatures twice at no additional mana cost thanks to Rebound. The Suspend spell Search for Tomorrow as a simple on-theme source of land ramp that helps us speed up and fix our mana base with an untapped basic, and Riversong's Diary as a slow but unique way to cast spells from exile for free by imprinting any instants or sorceries anyone casts from hand onto it, casting one at random on each of our turns once it reaches 4 or more spells stored, which should be an easy enough threshold to meet with 4 players regularly casting spells. Now, with our retained repertoire of exile sources complete, we'll be switching gears slightly to some of the spells that we held on to that can be cast from our graveyard that we can still use to proc our commander and other non-traditional casting payoffs with. Cards like the flashback spells Think Twice and Wreck and Rebuild, which help us pad our core stats with the draw and targeted removal they provide respectively while being castable twice, and proccing our payoffs with their second casting from the bin, as well as the flashback granting Return the Past, which allows us to flashback any of our instants and sorceries from the bin to get double the uses out of roughly a quarter of our deck, while, again, enabling our primary game plan as we do so. And then capping off our held over graveyard castable spells, Decaying Time Loop will be staying in the final build thanks to the repeatable card selection it gives us access to from the bin via Retrace to help us dig for more resources, and Me the Immortal will be holding on to her spot as well as a creature that we can not only cast from our bin by pitching 2 cards, but one that also retains the counter she gives herself and our other sources give her, making her an ever-growing threat that we can easily reanimate if needed between her own keyword counter production and our commander's +1/+1 counter distribution. And then, to help supplement and take advantage of the +1/+1 counter distribution the 13th Doctor will be empowering our board with, we'll be holding on to Danny Pink as both another source of counter distribution thanks to Mentor, as well as a repeatable source of card advantage as we load up our creatures with counters, and a Nardal Resourceful Cyborg as a +1/+1 counter payoff who generates more and more mana for us to cast our non-creature spells with as we load him up with counters, along with the counter distributing Last Night Together, which works nicely as an Alpha Strike enabler for our on-attack impulse drawing sources once we've loaded them up with counters, thanks to the additional counters, keywords, and extra combat phase it grants them. And lastly, as the only other support piece for the deck's primary game plan that made it into the final build, Clara Oswald hangs on to her spot as a passive way for us to get double the usage out of the Doctor's counter distribution and creature untapping, helping us empower our board even faster and get extra uses out of our creatures' tap effects. Then moving on to cards that we'll be keeping in order to pad the build's core stats, we'll be setting the foundation for our ramp package by having Growth Spiral, Farseek, and Cultivate stay in as staple sources of land-based ramp in our colors to help speed up and fix our mana base with, Soul Ring and Arcane Signet as essentially auto-include mana rocks to help build up our mana base with even further, and lastly, Carpet of Flowers as a superb reprint that, while niche, only needs a single one of our opponents to be in blue to generate us a steady stream of any colored mana on each of our turns for only a single mana. And then as some retained targeted removal to round out our core stat infrastructure with, we'll of course be hanging on to the staple removal spells Beast Within and Chaos Warp to help us deal with any type of threats our opponents can throw our way. Then quickly going over our retained mana lands, we'll of course be hanging on to Command Tower, Frontier Bivouac, and Path of Ancestry as lands that tap for all our colors to help improve consistency, Exotic Orchard as an untapped land that can tap for most, if not all our colors off our opponent's lands, both Horizon lands included in the base build as more untapped fixing for us to build up our mana base with, the check land, reveal lands, and slow lands included in the core build as even more fixing that can situationally come into play untapped to give us even more access to our colors without sacrificing too much speed to do so, Cinderglade and Sheltered Thicket as dual lands with basic land types that our non-basic land ramp sources can easily fetch up to improve consistency, and finally, Myriad Landscape as one last source of ramp from our land slot to provide one final boost to our mana base. Now, as for our kept utility lands, Ominous Cemetery will be staying in as a decent source of non-destruction creature removal from our land slot. Reliquary Tower keeps its spot as a way to protect us from overdrawing, which can happen if we prioritize casting our exiled spells too much. Desolated Lighthouse squeaks in as a serviceable source of card selection via its loot effect that can occasionally set up cards that we can cast from the bin to help enable our non-traditional casting payoffs, and Rogue's Passage retains its position as an easy way to ensure that our counter-laden creatures can reliably get in for damage even on the most clogged board states. And lastly, we'll be keeping the 4 islands, 3 mountains, and 4 forests included in the base build as our basics to round out our mana base. That leaves us with a final tally of 68 cards including basic lands that we'll be keeping from the base build, leaving us with 32 cards to replace, which is a bit more than usual, but only because we have enough budget left over to upgrade our land slot and ramp package to make our mana base a bit more efficient. So, now that we've covered all the cards that made the cut from the core build, let's move on to our upgrades. So, first things first, we'll be needing to add in more ways to enable the Doctor and our other Cast from Exile payoffs to keep the counters and value flowing as continually as possible. As such, on the creature side of things, we'll be subbing out the gigantic but underwhelming Beatsticks, Lunar Hatchling, and Frostfair Lurefish to sub in Lelia the Blade Reforged and Caves of Chaos Adventurer, both of whom impulse draws cards as they swing in, provide additional upside by either growing themselves as we exile our spells to cast, or by delving into the Undercity and eventually casting the spells it exiles for free, and both benefiting from our commander's counter distribution to allow them to more reliably survive combat thanks to their increased bulk, cutting the much too human-focused Carvanista Loyal Lupari and adding in Kami of Celebration in their place, which works with both our exile and our +1/+1 counter themes by turning any of the counter-laden creatures we swing in with into sources of repeatable impulse draw, and distributing even more counters as we cast those spells, and the more spellslinger and clue-focused the Fugitive Doctor losing her spot to another legend, Urabrask Heretic Praetor, who provides us with passive impulse draw on our turns to enable our game plan, while turning our opponent's draw step into impulse draw instead to either force them to cast that card or lose it for additional disruption. Then, as some additional impulse draw-like effects with some upside, we'll be removing the partner pairing of Jenny Flint and Madame Vastra, who would make a fantastic build-around, but whose more artifact token-themed game plan is not a good fit here, so we'll be putting in Plarg and Nasiri and Itali Primal Storm in their place, who may not be as cute of a couple, but do provide us with multiple free spells to cast from exile each turn for us to proc our payoffs with and to generate value, either passively on our upkeep or as they swing in. The somewhat lackluster non-traditional casting payoff Graham O'Brien losing his spot to Jacob Hauken Inspector, whose front face provides on-tap card selection that takes advantage of the free untap the Doctor provides, while simultaneously setting up his back face, Hawkins Insight, by exiling high CMC cards from our hand that we can later cast for free, and then continuing to exile cards off the top of our deck for us to cast later, and the out-of-play self-targeting Spellslinger payoff Bill Potts being benched so we can slot in Durnan of the Yawning Portal in her place, whose on-attack pseudo-impulse draw effect is both decent at letting us draw into more creatures to cast, and easy to trigger safely thanks to the Doctor loading him up with counters, and the fact that he reduces the cost of the creatures he hits by up to 3 by making them undaunted being the cherry on top. And then, to wrap up our sources of impulse draw with a wave of non-creature additions, we'll be replacing the jump-starting cantrip Start the TARDIS with the actual draw spell Ignite the Future, which initially impulse draws us 3, and later, thanks to flashback, exiles 3 more cards that we can then cast at no mana cost to continue to proc our commander with on top of itself. Flatlines AoE mass combat trick, losing its spot to Valakut Exploration, which instead provides us with repeatable impulse draw as we make our land drops, and, as a bonus, burns our opponents if we don't play the card it exiles, and the far too unreliable draw source Truth or Consequences being benched so we can make room for Chandra Torch of Defiance, who, like the previous entry, brings even more impulse draw and burn to the table, along with ramp, targeted removal, and a back-breaking ultimate that turns every single spell we cast into removal or burn to quickly take over the game with. We'll then also be adding one additional source of Cascade to the build by cutting the very unique but also very off-theme bottom drawing River Song, and adding in Maelstrom Wanderer in her place, whose double Cascade nets us 3 spells for the price of 1, and procs all our non-traditional casting payoffs twice, while their AoE haste granting is also useful to us to get immediate value out of all the on-attack impulse draw sources the build has at its disposal. Then, to help bolster our self-exiling spell numbers, so that we don't have to entirely rely on impulse draw to proc our payoffs, we'll be cutting the token-creating Saga Heaven Sent, and the soft targeted removal protection and evasion Psychic Paper provides, in favor of Raven Form and Delayed Blast Fireball, both of whom have Foretell to enable our game plan and help pad our core stats by being targeted removal and a board wipe respectively, with the latter also getting a significant boost to its power if we can cast it from exile by any means, as well as replacing the token-creating and doctor-fetching saga Fugitive of Jadoon with the adventure spell Tlinkali Hunter, whose adventure side allows us to pseudo-reanimate any one of our creatures from the bin by letting us recast it from exile, while its creature side serves as a gigantic trampling beatstick that also lets us cast a creature spell from exile for free each turn to not only help us build up our board state with, but to also ensure that any high CMC creatures we hit off impulse draw don't go to waste if we wouldn't be able to cast them otherwise. And then, as our final pair of new cast from exile-centric entrants that don't quite fit into our other categories, we'll be exchanging out the much too expensive theft removal spell Become the Pilot with the much cheaper You Find Some Prisoners, which we can still use as removal to pop back row, but also lets us use it as a way to exile and cast a card off our opponent's deck to proc our payoffs instead if needed, and replacing the 2 Doctor focused Twice Upon a Time, since we only have 2 Doctors in this build, with the Parting of Ways, whose ability to suspend any of our spells and then have those spells come off of suspend faster is superb at enabling our cast from exile game plan, while its multi-target artifact destruction is also much appreciated to help bolster our removal suite. Now, with all our new cast from exile spells covered, we'll proceed to add in some additional payoffs for them to work alongside the Doctor and our existing payoffs to generate us even more value as we cast them. With the Weird on Death payoff, the Jarian Witness being benched in favor of Wild Magic Sorcerer, whose ability to tack on a free cascade to the first spell we cast from exile each turn being much better suited to net us more value while proccing our payoffs an additional time. Dan Lewis's strange ability to turn our artifacts into equipment being axed to make room for Faldorn Dreadwolf Herald, who gives us another way to build up our board state with tokens as we cast our spells or play our lands from exile, while also giving us the option to pitch dead cards from our hand for more impulse draw if needed. And the much too random Strax Suntaran Nurse being sidelined so we can add in the much more reliable Nalfeshni, whose ability to get us 2 copies of any spell we cast from exile is an excellent payoff for our game plan, and whose gigantic evasive stat block is also good for loading up with counters to crack into our opponents with. And speaking of counters, we'll also be including some more ways to take advantage of all the counter distribution the Doctor will be doing now that it will be occurring more often, with us replacing the escape-granting Confession Dial with Kami of Whispered Hopes, which not only doubles our counter distribution, but is also a superb target to load up with counters thanks to it being a mana dork whose mana generation scales with its power that can take advantage of the Doctor's untapping to tap for even more mana, and the 2 cantrips included in the base build, Ponder and Preordain, being shelved so we can add in 2 more mana dorks in the form of Incubation Druid and Gyre Sage, which again becomes significantly better as we get counters on them to help us cast our exiled spells even faster. And lastly, with all our game plan enabling additions covered, we'll be using the remainder of our budget to help overhaul our ramp package and mana base, starting by replacing both talismans and both 3 mana rocks included in the base build, with a land ramp suite consisting of 3 visits, Nature's Lore, Rampant Growth, and Kodama's Reach, so we can take advantage of the powerful land-based ramp green provides to more reliably fix our mana base while simultaneously getting lands out of our deck, terraforming the core build's 3 temples into the land-type taplands, Wooded Ridgeland, Tangled Islet, and Highland Forest, to give our newly added non-basic land ramp sources more targets to fetch up and fix our colors with, and replacing the Badland here Gallifrey Council Chamber and the Badland in general Temple of the False God, with the 2 checklands Hinterland Harbor and Sulphur Falls, to again take advantage of our newly added land ramp sources and duels with land types to provide us with more untapped fixing for us to make use of. So, now that we've covered all 32 cards that we've upgraded from the core build, let's take a look at the breakdown for this Precon upgrade. This deck currently has 30 creatures including our commanders, 8 instants, 15 sorceries, 6 enchantments, 4 artifacts, 1 planeswalker, and 36 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 15 sources of Impulse Draw or Impulse Draw-like effects, 6 sources of Cascade, 10 cards that can exile themselves to be cast from exile, 8 miscellaneous ways to cast spells from outside of our hand, 12 cards that care about spells being cast from exile or from outside our hand in general, 8 creatures with tap effects, 14 cards that can generate or distribute +1/+1 counters, and 5 cards that care about +1/+1 counters, leaving us with a build that has plenty of sources and payoffs for both its non-traditional casting and +1/+1 counter-focused game plans for our commanders to enable and to take advantage of. Then for general deck stats, we have 19 ramp sources, 17 card draw sources, 10 targeted removal sources, and 2 board wipes. Our ramp being through the roof in this build due to us needing that mana to be able to cast our impulse drawn spells before we lose access to them, and our draw being very high as well since we'll need a lot of impulse draw to get the maximum mileage out of the Doctor, as well as our other cast from exile / non-traditional casting payoffs. Looking at our mana curve, we have 2 1-drops, 16 2-drops, 16 3-drops, 13 4-drops, 9 5-drops, 5 6-drops, 2 7-drops, and 1 8-drop, leaving us with a mid-weight curve that aims to ramp hard in the early game to build up our mana base with, and, once we've done that, dropping both of our commanders to begin impulse drawing 2 cards per rotation and distributing +1/+1 counters as we cast them. Then from there, it's just a matter of casting more and more spells from outside of our hands, hitting and proccing more and more payoffs while doing so, and making our creatures bigger and bigger as we do so, until our opponents are overwhelmed by the gigantic board states we're able to assemble. The final price of this build then comes out to be $84.75 after upgrades. This price does not include tax or shipping and assumes that the price you paid for the Precon was $50. The price of the cards was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. Now, for side grades, the only suggestion I would make would be swapping out the attack-dependent Impulse Draw sources, Caves of Chaos Adventurer, and Adernan of the Yawning Portal for the passive Impulse Drawing sources, Outpost Siege and Visions of Phyrexia, if we'd rather have some more quote-unquote reliable sources of exile-based casting, instead of bodies that we can load up with counters and crack in with. Then for further upgrades, we can consider replacing Nalfeshni with Atali Primal Conqueror to give us access to another source of free spells from exile when it comes down, that we can later transform into a resilient one-shotting machine that we can make even deadlier with +1/+1 counters. Decaying Time Loop can be swapped out for Passionate Archaeologist, which tacks on burn to every spell we cast from exile equal to its CMC, so we can whittle down our opponent's life totals while we cast our spells. And Me the Immortal can be benched in favor of Keeper of Secrets, giving us yet another way to turn the spells we cast from exile into burn, this time on a well-statted first striking body that we can empower with counters to build up our board even further. And if we're looking to overhaul our deck by stretching our bank account to its absolute limit, we can replace the land-type tap lands we added to the build with shock lands to maintain the consistency of our mana base via our non-basic land ramp sources without sacrificing speed like its predecessors, and then replace Desolated Lighthouse with Ketria Triome for good measure to give us one more fetchable land for us to work with, all for the bargain price of nearly the cost of the precon itself. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. So, now that we've covered the last of the Doctor Who precons, it's time for us to jump straight into the Lost Caverns of Ixalan precons because, evidently, I'm not allowed to rest. Starting with the Ahoy Mateys precon and its face commander, Admiral Brass Unsinkable. So look forward to a pirate-themed reanimator build featuring her coming soon. In the meantime though, be sure to check out our currently ongoing, at the time of posting this, 15k subscriber giveaway, where we'll be raffling off a full commander deck being helmed by Bernard Ginger Sculptor built by yours truly, and, as is tradition, giving you the opportunity to unlock some sweet upgrades for it depending on how many new subscribers the channel gets and how many likes the video gets before the drawing on November 15th. So either click on the card in this video or on the link in the description to go to the video where you can sign up for your chance to win. And, again, thank you all for your support for having helped the channel reach this milestone, as we wouldn't have gotten here without all of your support. And lastly, before we close out, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel can't continue to grow without your support. And if you're feeling particularly generous, feel free to keep me caffeinated via buying me a coffee at the link in the description, or alternatively, use our Game Nerds affiliate link in the description if you're looking to purchase sealed MTG product, accessories, board games, or any of their other wide selection of products at low prices that include free shipping for orders over $75, and a rewards program that builds up store credit over time as you make your purchases. And if any of you would like to support the channel in a different way, feel free to check out the other deck techs floating around my head if you'd like to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for a playlist of all the Cut Rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.